When Steve Winwood entered the studio in 1970, after the breakup of his supergroup Blind Faith, he thought he was going to record a solo album. However, with the recruitment of two of his former Traffic bandmates, that solo album turned into Traffic's fourth album, one of their most celebrated, John Barleycorn Must Die. It's a classic album that relies on all of Traffic's blues, jazz and rock influences. But amid all of these exciting progressive sounds lies the album's remarkable and a little bit unusual title track, an 18th century ballad for the 20th century. John Barleycorn Must Die.
John Barleycorn must die.
Hello there, it's Warren Hewitt here. Hope you're doing marvellously well. Welcome back to another episode in the series. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and if you hit that notification bell, you'll be notified when we have a new video. And of course, if you're into production, you can go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. Traffic was formed in Birmingham, England in 1967 by Steve Winwood, Jim Capaldi, Chris Wood and Dave Mason. Despite their young age, Winwood was only 19, they all had an impressive amount of music experience. Winwood had been the lead singer for the Spencer Davis Group since he was only 14 years old. The group had released 4 top 10 UK singles and 3 top 10 albums. They had even had 2 top 10 US singles. Capaldi likewise had formed his first band at the age of only 14. Soon after that, he was recording alongside Dave Mason in a Birmingham group called the Hellions, who had been signed by Pye Records. Mason left the Hellions to work as a roadie for Winwood's Spencer Davis Group. Chris Wood had been playing in Locomotive and Sounds of Blue. While Winwood, Capaldi and Mason had overlapping experiences working with their early groups, the origins of Traffic can really be traced to their shared experience jamming on stage at a club in Aston, Birmingham called the Elbow Room. It was here that all 4 original members of Traffic began to play music together, and the idea for Traffic was formed.
We met more really from the Elbow Room nightclub in Birmingham where we used to play. Then Steve would just, from knowing each other, he'd come up and jam. We just started jamming really, and that's, jamming is about the whole story of Traffic really.
To kick off their development as a band, the 4 musicians escaped to a cottage in Ashton Tirald, which is now in Oxfordshire but then was in Berkshire. They rehearsed, they wrote songs together and threw legendary parties for very high-profile guests, including Pete Townshend, Eric Burdon, Eric Clapton, and, as Winwood recalled, the main idea was that we wanted to be able to get together and play at all times of day or night, without having any complaints from the neighbours. In these early days, tensions were already arising between Mason and Winwood, who had different artistic visions for the music they wanted to create. The band's first releases were unattached singles. Paper Sun was written by Winwood and Capaldi and released in May of 1967, only a month after the band had formed. It hit number 5 in the UK. Hole in My Shoe was written by Mason, followed in August, and peaked at number 2 on the UK single charts. However, despite its success, the other members of the band were not pleased with its style. Dave very quickly started writing these quite poppy songs, but of course we didn't know how to deal with that, as we didn't want to be part of the pop world. Traffic for me was all about mixing jazz, folk, ethnic music, rock and R&B. We wanted to forge our own music by trying to combine those different elements. Because of these tensions, Mason left the group before the year was up, even before the release of their debut album, Mr. Fantasy, in December. He rejoined the group again briefly in 1968, combining his recent song compositions with those of the band to create their second self-titled album, which was released in October of 1968. The rest of the band dissolved soon after, in early 1969, when Winwood joined up with his friend Eric Clapton to form the short-lived supergroup Blind Faith, alongside Ginger Baker and Rick Gretsch. After the dissolution of Blind Faith, Winwood headed back into the studio, intending to record a solo album. However, this project became the site of a Traffic reunion, minus Mason, and resulted in the band's fourth release, John Barleycorn Must Die. While Traffic has embraced a wide range of musical influences in its history, especially jazz and blues, this particular album is notable for the folk rock centre of its title track. John Barleycorn is a haunting track, which, on the surface, seems to be a song about a brutal murder. Its opening lines begin, "There were 3 men came out of the west, their fortunes for to try. And these 3 men made a solemn vow, John Barleycorn must die." But Traffic's track actually relies on the folk song of John Barleycorn as a personification of the crop barley used to make bread, beer, and whiskey.
John Barleycorn as a song dates back to the Elizabethan era. And that's just when it was written down. It was likely circulating as an oral tradition before that. The legend of the barley plant in human form has even been argued to have ancient pagan origins. But the song we know, as recorded by Traffic, can be traced back to a family of folk songs all centered around the John Barleycorn theme. We can see this family, for instance, in Robert Jamison's 1806 folk song collection, Popular Ballads and Songs. In this collection, Jamison printed 6 separate songs which detail the story of the barley plant, or the beverages derived from it, as told through their personification, barley as man. The earliest of these songs was Alan Amot, which dates to sometime before 1568. Its language is a mix of an Old Scottish dialect and Norman French, and the character named here is not John, but instead Alan of the Malt. The second Alan Amot seems to have derived from the first, but this time it's modernized for 18th century Scottish listeners. So, by the 18th century, we already have at least 2 of these similarly themed songs, although the character's name is different from the English song. If we look at the English John Barleycorn songs, we begin with the Pleasant Ballad, which dates back at least as far as 1624. This one is important because it is where we first hear some of those core lyrical elements that we know from the Traffic version. First of these is the 3 men swearing an oath, although in these early versions they were knights and not farmers or men from the West. Then we have the image of rain followed by sun, and the description of John Barleycorn's beard. And finally, we have the rather grotesque image of the miller grinding John Barleycorn between 2 stones, one of the few images that is present in all of the John Barleycorn English language songs. And then there are at least 2 to 3 others that were circulating alongside these early versions. Now, what is interesting here is that sometime in the early 18th century, these songs started to drop off in popularity, largely becoming extinct. And this happens at the same time that 2 newer John Barleycorn songs appear. One that focuses primarily on the John Barleycorn is beer, and the other, the more popular version, which became the one we all know, and that Traffic reimagined in 1970. This popular version shares many links with the ones in Jamison's 1806 book, as well as other sources of the song. So we can see that the song has been recomposed many times over the centuries, and then it continues to get refined for the next 100 to 200 years. Thus, by the 20th century, we have a well-established John Barleycorn tradition. We have several field recordings of folk musicians performing the song in the early 1900s as well. In fact, beloved British classical composer Ralph Vaughan Williams used the song in his 1928 English folk song suite. So the song was present and available to a new generation of folk revivalists in the second half of the 20th century. This brings us to the context of Traffic choosing this particular song in the 1970s. We have to remember, Traffic wasn't discovering or rediscovering some old, lost British folk song in a vacuum. As a band, Traffic was very much in the psychedelic experimental world, so the idea of playing an old British folk song was a bit different for them. But the concept of a contemporary rock group performing an old British legend was absolutely of the time. By the late 60s, England musically was thoroughly involved in an electric folk revival. With bands like Fairport Convention and Steel Ice Bands, audiences were invested in reimagined folk songs through the sounds of late 1960s musical values. So when Traffic picks up this song in 1970, they're exploring the same sound world of not only these more folk song-focused groups, but also bands like Led Zeppelin or Jethro Tull, who were also fascinated with the dramatic, haunting, and very British folk past.
So let's learn a little bit more about the melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic structure of the song from arguably the greatest music theorist on the internet. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. 12-Tone himself.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is form. Like many folk songs, John Barleycorn consists of a single verse repeated over and over with short interludes in between. This simple form makes the song incredibly easy to follow, which is unusual. I mean, this is Traffic we're talking about. They're a prog band, and while John Barleycorn isn't their most complex album, if you look at songs like Stranger to Himself or Every Mother's Son, there's still plenty going on. The decision to anchor the album with this relatively straightforward folk tune helps provide some thematic contrast, creating a nice relaxing interlude in the middle. Anyway, the verse is arranged as an AABA pattern with 4 lines, each representing a 4-bar phrase. Or, I say 4 bars, but it's not quite that simple. In each of the A sections, the lyrics are split into 2 halves, a setup and a payoff, and in between those 2 halves, they add an extra half bar to create a little anticipation. In the B section, the vocals are uninterrupted, but they add a 5th bar at the end to hang on the last chord before returning to the final A section. Now, on paper, this might seem like some sort of proggy experimentation with meter, and considering the source, that's not a bad guess, but if you listen to the song, it's just not what it sounds like. In fact, you may not even notice these extra bars at all, and that's because there's a much simpler explanation. You see, these sorts of extra bars are all over folk music. They're what I like to call breath bars, and they're especially common in settings where the singer is simply accompanying themselves. If you don't have a whole band to synchronize with, you can get away with adding and removing beats pretty much whenever you want, as long as the overall effect makes sense. Breath bars allow you to stretch out musical moments that are particularly meaningful to give your audience a chance to really absorb them. Now, in this case, there is a band to sync with, so instead of ad-libbing them, they stick to a consistent pattern, but the impact is the same. It's a moment to rest and hang on that last line before moving on to the next one. In terms of melodies, each section is set up as a period, kind of like a question and answer. In the first half, Winwood starts on B, the 5th, then walks down the minor pentatonic scale to E, the root. From there, he turns around and walks back up, but this time he hits F sharp along the way, turning it into a full minor scale. This extra note makes the walk back up feel a little bit longer than the fall down. It's a subtle touch, but to me it creates this sense of growing weight and effort, which is fitting for a song about hard labor. The second half returns to pentatonic, but this time instead of walking back up at the end, he drops down to D, then slides back up to E for a nice satisfying resolution. This period structure makes it so that each A section feels self-contained. The question ends on an unstable point, implying further motion, while the answer mirrors it but ends on the root, providing a complete melodic stopping point. It also has a relatively limited range. The whole thing spans a major 6th, so most people should be able to sing it comfortably in one register or another. In the B section, that melody expands, walking up the entire minor pentatonic scale to a high E before falling back down to hang on B. Between the change in melodic shape and the removal of the breath bar in the middle, this feels less like a question and answer and more like one long phrase, ending on the same note as the A section's first half, so unlike those, this part doesn't feel complete. It doesn't resolve, so it relies on the last A section to serve as like a larger scale response to its unanswered question. But the most interesting thing here is the appearance of C sharp near the end of the line. This pulls us out of minor and puts us in a scale called Dorian, which is kinda like happy minor. It has all the beautiful melancholy of the minor scale without feeling quite so dark and sad. Dorian is pretty common in English folk music, so it's not surprising to see it here. In fact, it's even less surprising because the harmony's been telling us the whole time. If we go back to the A section for a moment, it starts on A, the 4 chord, but in natural minor, this should be A minor. A major contains a C sharp, so it's already setting us up in Dorian from the very beginning. From there, we go to the 1 chord, then do this cool little pentatonic trill, harmonizing the notes above and below our root before returning back to 1. In the second half, we do the same thing, but we cut out that first E minor. This shifts the metric position of the trill. The first time it started on beat 1, while the return to E came on beat 3, so the metric emphasis was on the trill, not the resolution. The second time, though, the trill starts on beat 3 and resolves on beat 1 for a more complete landing, mirroring the sense of closure in the melody. In the B section, we again switch things up. In the melody, we saw that the first half ended on the root, and the same thing happens here. We begin with G major, the flat 3, then E minor, the 1. Much like how the high range of the melody made the root feel less like a resolution, resolution though, this chord motion doesn't really feel like a landing. Moving by third tends to sound pretty weak, so even though we've returned to one, we haven't really resolved to it. From there we go back to G major, then we start walking up the scale, first to A major, then B major, the 5 chord, which we hang on for 2 full bars, including a breath bar to really soak in that chord's directional flavor. Again, the A sections are self-contained, but the B section is incomplete, and this long-held harmony forces you to really engage with that. And that's pretty much it. Or, I mean, no, it's not. There's a lot to say about the production and orchestration of this song too, but for that, I think I should probably hand you back to Warren.
John Barleycorn Must Die was recorded in the spring of 1970 at both Island Studios and Olympic Studios in London. Since the sessions were originally intended to create Winwood's solo album, he began the process by trying to perform everything himself. I began trying to make music all on my own with tape machines and overdubbing and stuff. But it was a very good way of writing, but it was a weird way of making music. The whole thing that makes music special is people. I was getting to the point that I needed the input of other people. It seemed inhuman to make records just by overdubbing. This inspired him to bring in his old Traffic bandmates Capaldi and Wood. But with the trio back together, the album moved in a new creative direction, which embraced all of their talents. Winwood recalled, "I felt we really had something that was our own. I played most of the instruments. Well, you say that, but the flute and the sax were crucial. Chris played the smallest part, but contributed the most to Traffic. He used to bring us music to listen to. Japanese classical, obscure American jazz. When we did these jams, he was the one in control of the recording equipment. And of course, Jim played drums on everything and wrote the lyrics. There's something we created which was quite special." The choice to perform John Barleycorn on the album has been attributed to Chris Wood, who had heard the song on a 1965 recording by the Watersons on their debut album Frost and Fire. The Watersons recording was completely a cappella, giving it a haunting, ancient feel.
And little Sir John and the nut brown balls proved the strong.
Traffic creates their own interpretation by using acoustic instrumentation. Guitars, flute, and of course Winwood's perfectly expressed vocals. Wood's delicate flute line captures the mystical resonances of the track and transports the listener into a completely new sonic space. The vocal harmonies enter as the lyrics move to the time of harvesting. It is a powerful choice emphasizing the dramatization of this action.
They've hired men with the side so sharp.
The album was produced predominantly by Winwood and Island Records co-founder Chris Blackwell. Guy Stevens also received a production credit on the album. It was mixed and engineered by Brian Humphreys and Andy Johns, brother of another legendary engineer and producer, Glyn Johns. Andy Johns boasts his own impressive catalogue, including engineering and mixing several huge albums with artists like Led Zeppelin, Jethro Tull, and the Rolling Stones, amongst many others. He had worked on the Blind Faith album with Winwood shortly before John Barleycorn. The album was released on July the 1st, 1970. It hit number 11 on the UK album charts and number 5 in the US, making John Barleycorn Must Die the band's best charting album in the US. It has also been certified gold by the RIAA. John Barleycorn was never released as a single, but it certainly caught attention as one of the album's most captivating tracks. In his 1970 review of the album for Rolling Stone, John Carroll wrote, "The best cut on the album is probably the title tune, a traditional English ballad arranged by Winwood for acoustic guitar and flute. Wood's flute is again exceptional, delicate and ornate, and Steve sings the song just right, with an admirable sense of restraint and simplicity. Simple, but it works." Over 50 years later, the song remains one of Traffic's most adored classics. Taking a ballad that dates back to at least the 18th century, Winwood, Capaldi and Wood created an iconic track. Not only for their time, but one which would carry the legendary tune into the future. Thanks ever so much for watching the video. If you haven't already, please check out the other videos in the series. Of course, you can go down below here and leave suggestions for other artists, other albums, other singles you would like us to cover. Thanks, and have a marvellous time. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, adio, tschüss, goodbye.